Chapter 1. The Chamber of Shadows. The torches flicker against stone walls that have witnessed centuries of power, but never this. Never a father standing over his son with the weight of execution in his eyes. The prince kneels in the center of the chamber with his wrists bound with iron chains that bite into his flesh. He is 23 years old. His breath comes in shallow gasps, not from fear, though fear courses through him, like poison, but from disbelief around him. The silence is suffocating. Courtiers line the walls like statues, with their faces carved from shadow and complicity. None will meet his gaze. The king stands 10 paces away, draped in royal purple that now seems more like a funeral shroud. His hands tremble, not with age. He is still a powerful man, but with something darker, something that has been eating at him for months, perhaps years. His eyes, once warm when they looked upon this boy, are now cold and distant, as if he is staring at a stranger, or worse, a threat. The executioner enters from the side door. He carries a brass tray, and upon it rest instruments that gleam dully in the torchlight. The prince's stomach turns. He knows what they are for. Everyone in this room knows. Father, the word escapes his lips like a prayer, but it falls into the void between them. The king does not respond. He cannot. To speak now would be to acknowledge the humanity of the moment, and he has spent too many sleepless nights convincing himself that this is necessity, not murder, that this is strategy, not sin. An advisor steps forward, one of the king's most trusted, a man whose silver tongue has whispered poison into the royal air for months. He unrolls a scroll with his voice echoing of the marble with practiced authority. By decree of His Majesty, for crimes of conspiracy, treason, and the intent to usurp the rightful throne, the prince is hereby sentenced. The prince closes his eyes. He already knows the whole kingdom will know by morning. But in this moment, in this chamber, where his childhood memories still linger in every corner, he understands with crushing clarity. His father has chosen the throne over his son. The executioner approaches. The instruments clink softly against the brass. Please, the prince whispers, and this time it is not to his father, but to God, to history, to anyone who might be listening beyond these walls. The torches flicker once more, and the scene freezes, suspended in that terrible moment before brutality becomes reality. How did a beloved prince end up kneeling beneath his father's dagger? To understand that, we must go back to before the paranoia, before the whispers, before the fear transformed love into violence. We must return to the beginning, when the prince was not a threat, but a hope, when his birth was celebrated, not cursed, when his father still smiled at him. Chapter 2. Origins of a doomed heir. 23 years earlier, bells rang across the capital for 3 days straight. A son had been born to the king, not just any son, a healthy, strong boy with lungs that filled the royal chambers with cries of life. The queen, exhausted but radiant, held him against her chest. As physicians proclaimed him perfect, the astrologers were summoned immediately. They arrived with their charts and instruments, calculating the position of stars and the alignment of planets. The king paced outside the birthing chamber, waiting for their verdict. In those days, he was a different man, younger, more idealistic, still believing that destiny was something you could control. When the chief astrologer emerged, his face was troubled. Your Majesty, he began carefully, the child is blessed by Mars and favored by Jupiter. He will be charismatic, beloved by soldiers and common folk alike. He will possess the qualities of a great leader. The king's face broke into a smile. Then why do you look as if you bring ill news? The astrologer hesitated. There is a shadow in the chart, Your Majesty. The boy's strength may one day eclipse your own. He will rise so high that... He paused, choosing his words with the caution of a man who knows kings kill messengers. That the kingdom may struggle to hold two suns in its sky. The king dismissed him with a wave. Superstition. Old wives' tales. What father wouldn't want his son to be great? But the seed was planted. The prince grew, and true to the prophecy, he grew magnificently. By age 7, he could recite poetry in 3 languages. By 10, he rode better than knights twice his age. By 15, soldiers would stop their drills just to watch him train, and courtiers would whisper that the boy had the bearing of a king already. The queen adored him. She would sit with him in the gardens, teaching him philosophy, history, and the stories of great rulers who balanced power with mercy. Remember, she would tell him with her hand gentle on his shoulder, a crown is heaviest on the heart. Rule with wisdom, not fear. He listened to every word. The people loved him too. When he rode through the capital, citizens would line the streets cheering his name with an enthusiasm they hadn't shown the king in years. Merchants would offer him gifts. Children would run alongside his horse. Once, when a plague threatened the lower districts, the prince personally visited the sick, distributing food and medicine, while the king remained safely in the palace. "That boy will be remembered," an old woman said as she watched him pass with her eyes wet with gratitude. She had no idea how right she was, but in the marble halls of power every cheer for the prince became a whisper of concern. Nobles began to divide, not openly, but in the subtle ways that court politics operate. Some saw the prince as the future of fresh hope after years of the king's increasingly erratic rule. Others saw him as a threat to stability, a popular figure who could be manipulated by enemies of the crown. The king's advisors began to pose careful questions. "Your Majesty, have you considered how quickly the boy gains influence? The people's love for him is unusually strong, isn't it? What happens when a prince outshines his father before his time?" At first, the king dismissed them. His son was his pride, his legacy. But late at night, alone in his chambers, he would stand at the window overlooking the city and wonder, when the people chanted his son's name, were they forgetting his own? When generals praised the prince's tactical mind, were they questioning the king's? The prince, innocent of these machinations, continued to excel. He studied statecraft, military strategy, and philosophy. He befriended scholars and warriors alike. He was everything a kingdom could want in its future ruler. And that was exactly the problem, because the king wasn't ready to be the past. One evening during a state banquet, a foreign ambassador made a toast to the prince. He declared, raising his goblet, "The rising sun of this great kingdom." The all erupted in applause. The king smiled and raised his own cup, but those closest to him saw his knuckles whiten around the stem. Every smile the prince earned became one more seed of paranoia in the king's mind. And in a kingdom where the throne is everything, paranoia is the deadliest poison of all. Chapter 3. Kingdom in fear. The crops failed in the third year of drought. It began in the outer provinces, where farmers watched their fields turn from green to brown to dust. By harvest season, entire villages were abandoned, with their inhabitants flooding toward the capital in desperate streams of refugees. The granaries, once overflowing, began to empty. Bread prices tripled, then quintupled. The king convened his council, demanding solutions. His advisors argued among themselves. Some advocated for opening the royal reserves, while others pushed for purchasing grain from neighboring kingdoms at ruinous prices. The finance minister warned that the treasury couldn't sustain another year like this. The military commander cautioned that hungry people become rebellious people. The prince, now 20 years old and officially part of the council, proposed a different approach. "We should invest in irrigation systems," he suggested, with his voice calm and measured. "Not a temporary fix, but infrastructure that prevents this from happening again. We have engineers who we don't have time for grand projects," the king snapped, with his patience fraying. "We need food now, not aqueducts 5 years from now." The prince fell silent, but his idea spread through the court like wildfire. Younger nobles latched onto it. Scholars praised its long-term thinking. Even some of the older advisors admitted privately that the boy had wisdom beyond his years. The king heard every whispered comparison. As famine gripped the kingdom, unrest followed. Riots broke out in the capital's poorest districts. The city guard was deployed, but their efforts were half-hearted. Many of them were starving too. 3 nobles were attacked in their carriages. A tax collector was thrown into the river. The king grew increasingly isolated, surrounded by guards even within his own palace. He stopped attending public functions. His appearances became rare, and when he did emerge, he looked haunted and aged beyond his years. The weight of the crown had become unbearable. Foreign powers sensed weakness. Envoys from rival kingdoms arrived with smiles and veiled threats, offering assistance that came with conditions. trade concessions, territorial rights, and marriage alliances that would tie the kingdom to their influence. The king knew these offers for what they were: vultures circling a dying beast. But he had no choice. He signed treaties that diminished his authority. He made concessions that previous kings would have gone to war over. And through it all, the prince grew more capable, more respected, and more dangerous. It was during this crisis that the transformation truly began. The king's most senior advisor, a man named Corvus, whose family had served the throne for generations, began to spend long hours alone with the king. No one knew exactly what was discussed in those private meetings, but the king would emerge from them, looking even more troubled, with his eyes dark with suspicion. Corvus was a master of implication. He never accused the prince directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he planted questions. "Your Majesty, have you noticed how calm the prince remains during this crisis?" Almost as if he expected it. The people's chants for the prince grow louder each day. One might wonder if certain parties are encouraging such sentiment. A popular prince during a weak reign history is full of such moments, isn't it? And they rarely end well for the sitting king. The king would defend his son, but the defenses grew weaker each time. Because deep down in the darkest corner of his heart, he had noticed the same things. The way soldiers brightened when the prince entered a room. The way nobles sought the prince's counsel instead of his own. The way his son's suggestions were implemented with enthusiasm, while his own orders were met with reluctant obedience. The prince, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the shift. He saw his father's distance as stress, not suspicion. He redoubled his efforts to help, taking on more responsibilities, solving more problems, and being more present. Each solution he provided drove another nail into his own coffin. One night, after a particularly contentious council meeting, the prince approached his father in private. "Father," he said softly, with concern etched on his young face, "you seem troubled." "If there's anything I can do, you've done enough," the king interrupted, and something in his tone made the prince step back. They stared at each other across the dim chamber, and for the first time the prince felt a chill of something he couldn't name. Something that felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet. The king turned away. "Leave me," the prince obeyed. But as he walked through the darkened corridors back to his own chambers, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. That the father who had once taught him to write, who had celebrated his achievements, and who had promised him the world, that man was becoming a stranger. In the throne room, the king sat alone long after midnight, staring at the empty seat beside his own. The seat where his heir would one day sit. If he allowed it. When fear rules a throne, even a son becomes a threat. And in the shadows of the palace, Corvus smiled, knowing that fear once planted grows faster than any crop. Chapter 4. Whispers in the marble halls. The first letter appeared on the king's desk on a moonless night. No one saw who delivered it. The guards swore the chamber had been secured with the doors locked, yet there it lay, a folded parchment sealed with unmarked wax. The king's hands trembled as he broke the seal. "Your Majesty, there are those within your court who plot your downfall. The prince meets with generals in secret. They speak of a new age and a new rule. Beware the son who cannot wait for his inheritance. A friend of the crown." The king read it 3 times. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Anonymous accusations were common in court and were weapons wielded by rivals against rivals. But something about the timing and the specificity made him pause. Did the prince meet with generals? Yes, of course. He was being trained in military matters. In secret? Well, the king himself wasn't always informed of every meeting. He called for Corvus. The advisor arrived within minutes, as if he had been waiting nearby. His face showed concern as he read the letter. "Disturbing, Your Majesty. Though I hesitate to give credence to anonymous accusations. But..." The king heard the unspoken word. "But the prince has been spending considerable time with Commander Aldrich lately, and General Thorne. Both men command significant loyalty among the troops." Corvus set the letter down carefully. "I am certain it's innocent." "Training, as you said. Still, perhaps. Prudence suggests we observe more closely." The king nodded slowly. Perhaps the second letter arrived a week later. This one named specific meetings and specific times. It described conversations how the prince had allegedly discussed the kingdom's weaknesses, how he had questioned his father's recent treaties, and how he had suggested that new leadership might restore stability. Corvus happened to be present when this letter was discovered. "Your Majesty, this is serious. These details. Someone is either fabricating with incredible skill or they're reporting truth," the king finished. "We must investigate," Corvus urged. "Discreetly, of course. We cannot accuse the prince based on anonymous letters, but we also cannot ignore them." The investigation began quietly. The king's personal spies, men whose loyalty was bought with gold and sealed with fear, were deployed throughout the palace. They watched the prince's movements, listened at doors, and questioned servants. And they found nothing. Or rather, they found exactly what one would expect to find. A prince performing his duties, studying his future role, and meeting with military leaders and administrators as part of his education. Nothing treasonous, nothing conspiratorial. But Corvus had anticipated this. The absence of evidence, he explained to the king, might itself be evidence. "A clever conspirator leaves no traces, Your Majesty. The prince is intelligent. If he plots, he would do so carefully." The logic was poisonous and perfect. Any proof of innocence became proof of cunning guilt. More letters came. They arrived with increasing frequency, with each one more detailed than the last. They described gestures, glances, and whispered conversations in gardens. They quoted the prince's words, sometimes accurately, and sometimes with subtle twists that changed innocent statements into sinister suggestions. "The kingdom needs strength," the prince had said during a council meeting, referring to military readiness. "The kingdom needs strength," the letter repeated, adding, "which he implies his father no longer possesses." The prince's friends began to disappear. His childhood tutor, Master Elian, was the first. He was arrested on charges of corruption, falsified records of payments made to foreign scholars. The prince protested his innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. Elian was imprisoned in the palace dungeons. Lord Marcus, a young noble who had been the prince's closest companion since boyhood, was next. His family's estates were suddenly audited, and irregularities were discovered. Marcus was banished to a remote monastery and was forbidden from any contact with the royal family. Lady Serena, a court poet who had often conversed with the prince about literature and philosophy, was accused of spreading seditious verse. She vanished one night, and no one dared ask where. The prince watched his world contract. Each disappearance was explained with reasonable accusations and documented evidence. But he felt it in his bones that something was systematically destroying everyone close to him. He tried to speak with his father, but the king would no longer grant him private audiences. Their interactions became limited to formal council meetings where the king's gaze was cold and measuring. "Father, please, something is wrong," the prince attempted once, catching the king in a corridor. Guards immediately stepped between them. "His Majesty is not to be disturbed," one said firmly. The prince stared past them, meeting his father's eyes. "Father?" The king looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment the prince saw it. The suspicion, the fear, the terrible certainty of a man who has already made up his mind. The king turned and walked away. That night the prince sat alone in his chambers, surrounded by books and maps and all the tools of his education. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. For the first time in his life, he felt truly afraid. Not of external enemies or physical danger, but of something more insidious. The inability to defend against accusations you don't know you are facing. He thought of reaching out to the generals and to his remaining allies, but stopped himself. Any action he took could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Any word he spoke could be reported, distorted, and weaponized. He was trapped in a web he couldn't see, spun by hands he couldn't identify. In the king's chambers, another letter had arrived. The prince plans to act soon. He knows your suspicions grow. He meets with Commander Aldrich tomorrow at dawn in the Eastern Garden. This may be your only chance to catch him in treasonous counsel. Act now before it is too late. The crown's last friend. Corvus read the letter over the king's shoulder. "Your Majesty, if this is true, send men to the Eastern Garden at dawn. the king ordered with his voice hollow. Hidden. Watching, I need to know. The prince soon realized that walls have ears, and those ears were sharpening knives. At dawn in the Eastern Garden, Commander Aldrich would indeed meet with the prince, but not for conspiracy, for a training session in military strategy that had been scheduled for weeks. It wouldn't matter. The trap had been set, and the prey was already caught. Chapter 5. The betrayal unveiled. The arrest came at sunrise. The prince was in the Eastern Garden, exactly as the letter had predicted, standing beside Commander Aldrich as they reviewed maps of the kingdom's borders. It was their weekly routine, a tutorial on military strategy that the king himself had approved months ago. They didn't hear the guards approaching until it was too late. 12 armed men emerged from the colonnade with their captain at the front and his hand on his sword. "Your Highness," he said with his voice lacking its usual deference, "you are commanded to come with us." The prince looked up from the maps, confused. Commanded? By whom? By His Majesty the King. Immediately, Commander Aldrich stepped forward with his withered face creasing with concern. "What is the meaning of this? We have permission to. You, Commander, are also to come." The captain's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "Both of you." Now, the walk through the palace corridors was the longest of the prince's life. Guards lined the walls, men he had known since childhood who had trained him and protected him. None would meet his eyes now. The only sound was the rhythmic clank of armor and the echo of boots on marble. They were brought to the great throne room. The space was vast and cold and was designed to intimidate. The king sat upon the elevated throne, looking down at them. Beside him stood Corvus and 3 other senior advisors with their faces grave. The prince looked up at his father, searching for recognition, for warmth, and for any trace of the man who had once held him as a child. He found none. "Father, what is this?" Silence. The king's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "You will speak only when questioned." The prince's breath caught. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a trial. Corvus stepped forward, unrolling a scroll. His voice echoed of the marble as he read. "Prince of the realm, you stand accused of conspiracy, to commit treason, of plotting to usurp the rightful throne, of meeting in secret with military commanders to plan insurrection, and of attempting to turn the hearts of the people against your sovereign lord and father." Each word landed like a physical blow. "That's insane," the prince breathed. "Father, you know this isn't," I said. Silence. The king's shout reverberated through the chamber. For a moment, his composure cracked, revealing something raw beneath anguish mixed with fury. "Do you think me a fool? Do you think I don't see what you've been doing?" "I've been doing nothing except serve you and the kingdom." The prince's voice rose in desperation. "Whatever you've been told, whatever evidence you think you have, it's false. I would never, you would never." The king rose from his throne, descending the steps toward his son. "You who the people cheer louder than their king. You who generals seek for counsel instead of their commander. You who moves through this palace as if you already wear the crown, because you've been preparing me for it." The prince's composure finally broke. "Every lesson, every responsibility you gave me, I've done exactly what you asked. How is that treason?" For a moment, father and son stood face to face, and something flickered in the king's eyes. Doubt, regret, recognition of the impossible trap they had both fallen into. Then Corvus cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, if I may present the evidence." The moment passed. The king's face hardened again. He returned to his throne. "Present it." What followed was a masterpiece of fabrication. Letters were produced, dozens of them, bearing the prince's seal. Conversations were recounted by witnesses who described meetings that had never occurred. A map was presented, allegedly found in the prince's chambers, showing strategic points within the palace marked for seizure. Commander Aldrich, standing beside the prince, grew pale as he realized the scope of the conspiracy. Not the prince's conspiracy against the king, but the conspiracy against the prince. "Your Majesty," he tried to interject, "I can verify that many of these alleged meetings, never the commander is compromised." Corvus interrupted smoothly. "He has been deceived by the prince's charisma, as have many loyal men. That is why this conspiracy is so dangerous." Aldrich's jaw clenched, but he fell silent. To continue protesting would only implicate himself further. The prince watched the proceedings with growing horror. Each piece of evidence was plausible if you didn't know it was false. Each witness testimony contained just enough truth, a real meeting twisted into treason, and an actual conversation with context stripped away to sound credible. He had no defense. How do you prove you didn't say something? How do you document the absence of conspiracy? This is orchestrated, the prince said finally, with his voice quiet but clear. Someone has been working against me, planting evidence and spreading lies. Father, I'm begging you, investigate who is truly behind this. The king's face was stone. I have investigated for months. The evidence all points to you. Then the evidence was planted. Father, please, the prince's voice cracked. You've known me my entire life. You raised me. Do you truly believe I'm capable of this? The question hung in the air. Everyone in the chamber held their breath waiting for the king's answer. Because if he said no, if he admitted even a shred of doubt, the entire proceedings would collapse. The king looked at his son. 23 years of memories surely flashed through his mind. First steps, first words, and first victories. The boy who had looked at him with such admiration. The young man who had tried so hard to make him proud. But fear is a powerful alchemist. It transmutes love into suspicion and memories into threats. I believe, the king said slowly, with each word carefully weighted, that power corrupts even the best of men. That ambition can poison the purest heart, and that the throne makes enemies even of those we love most. It was not an answer. It was a justification. The prince's shoulders sagged. In that moment, he understood his father had already decided. This trial was theatre. The verdict had been written before he ever entered the room. Then God have mercy on both of us, the prince whispered. Corvus stepped forward once more. Your Majesty, there is one more witness. One whose testimony cannot be questioned. Guards brought in a broken figure, Master Elian, the prince's childhood tutor. The old man could barely walk, his robes were stained and his face was bruised. He had been in the dungeons for 3 weeks. The prince's heart shattered. Elian, the old tutor, raised his eyes, and they were full of tears and apology. Forgive me, he whispered. Master Elian, Corvus prompted. Tell his Majesty what you told us about the prince's true intentions. Elian's voice was barely audible. The prince, he spoke to me of his frustrations, of how he believed he could rule better than his father, how the kingdom needed new leadership. No, the prince breathed. Elian, no, I never. He asked me to help him. Elian continued, with each word clearly causing him agony. To gather supporters, to prepare for succession. Before the natural time. It was the final nail. Testimony from the prince's most trusted mentor and the man who had taught him ethics and honor. Even if coerced, even if broken by torture, it would carry weight. The prince didn't even try to refute it. What was the point? Elian had clearly been tortured into saying whatever they wanted. The game was rigged from the start. The king rose slowly from his throne. I have heard enough. Your Majesty, the prince said one last time, if you do this, if you condemn me based on lies and false testimony, the kingdom will know, history will know. Is that the legacy you want? The king's face twitched. For just a second, the mask cracked. But Corvus was already beside him, whispering urgently, the people must see strength, Your Majesty. Any mercy now will be seen as weakness. Your enemies will interpret doubt as opportunity. The king straightened. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a king, not a father. For the crimes of treason, conspiracy, and betrayal of the crown, I find you guilty. He paused, and his next words came slowly, as if he were lifting an unbearable weight. But you are still my blood. I will not execute you. The prince's brief flash of hope tied with the king's next sentence. But the king wasn't done. He demanded a punishment that would erase the prince forever. The words that followed would echo through history as one of the cruelest sentences ever pronounced by a father upon his son. A punishment designed not just to neutralize a threat, but to destroy a legacy, to ensure that the prince could never again be seen as a viable heir, and could never inspire loyalty, or never be a symbol of hope. The king would take his son's future by taking his eyes. Chapter 6. The blinding of the air. They returned to the chamber where our story began. The circular room had been prepared. Torches burned in their sconces, casting violent shadows across walls that seemed to close in like the walls of a tomb. The prince was brought in chains, heavy, unnecessary chains for a man who had already lost everything. He was forced to kneel in the center. The stone was cold beneath his knees. Around him, the witnesses assembled. Court officials required by law to observe royal punishments, ensuring they were carried out as decreed. Their faces were pale. Some looked away. None would forget what they were about to witness. The executioner entered, and with him came the instruments of cruelty, the tools that would transform a prince into a living ghost. The king stood at the edge of the chamber with his face an unreadable mask. Corvus remained at his side, steady and solid, a pillar of conviction, while the king seemed barely able to stand. "Father," the prince said one final time. His voice was steady now and resigned. "Before you do this, I want you to know I forgive you. And I love you. I always have." The king flinched as if struck. His hand gripped the edge of a nearby table until his knuckles went white. For a terrible moment, it seemed he might stop everything, call it off, pull his son into his arms, and admit the horrific mistake. Then Corvus leaned close and whispered, "History will judge you weak if you falter now." The king's face hardened. He nodded to the executioner. "Proceed." The executioner was a professional. He had served the crown for 20 years, carrying out sentences that ranged from flogging to execution. But this was different. This was a prince. This was the king's own son. His hands shook as he prepared. 2 guards forced the prince's head back, holding it immobile. The prince didn't struggle. What would be the point? He closed his eyes, trying to find some final moment of peace and some memory to hold onto before the darkness. He thought of his mother long dead, who had taught him to be kind. He thought of the gardens where he had played as a child. He thought of the kingdom he had hoped to serve and make better. The executioner selected the first instrument, a slender iron rod heated until its tip glowed dull red. The ancient method used for centuries on traitors and rivals. Designed not just to blind, but to ensure the blindness was permanent, unmistakable, and visible to all who would see the prince afterward. "Begin," the king commanded with his voice hollow. The prince's scream shattered the silence. It was a sound that would haunt every person in that chamber for the rest of their lives. Not just pain, though the pain was unimaginable, but the anguish of betrayal and the agony of a trust destroyed so completely that physical torture became merely an afterthought. The process was methodical and horrific. The executioner worked with grim efficiency, following the protocols established by centuries of royal cruelty. Smoke rose, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning flesh. The witnesses turned away, with some pressing hands to their mouths. One young courtier vomited in the corner. The king watched. He made himself watch. This was his decree and his sentence. To look away would be cowardice. But his face betrayed everything. Tears streamed down his cheeks unchecked. His jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might shatter. His hands gripped the table as if he were the one being tortured. Corvus remained impassive beside him, a dark angel whispering encouragement. "You're doing what's necessary. You're protecting the throne. You're ensuring stability." The prince's screams eventually subsided into sobs, then into silence. Not the silence of relief, but of a spirit breaking. The executioner finished his work and stepped back with his own hands trembling. It was done. The prince knelt in the center of the chamber with his head bowed and his face covered by cloths soaked in blood and herbs meant to prevent infection. His breath came in ragged gasps. His body shook with shock and pain, but he was alive. If this broken, shattered thing could still be called alive. The king took a step forward and stopped. What could he say? What words could possibly bridge the chasm that had opened between them? "Take him to his chambers," he ordered. "Summon the physicians." Guards moved forward, lifting the prince carefully. As they carried him past his father, the prince's head turned slightly, as if by instinct, seeking one last glimpse of the man who had destroyed him. But there was nothing to see now. Only darkness. Eternal and absolute darkness. The king stood alone in the chamber long after everyone had left. The torches burned low. The instruments of torture lay discarded on their brass tray. He had won. He had eliminated the threat. The throne was secure. So why did he feel as if he had lost everything? In the prince's chambers, physicians worked frantically to treat the wounds and to save what remained. The prince lay motionless, neither speaking nor responding. He had gone somewhere deep inside himself, to a place beyond pain and beyond betrayal, beyond hope. A young servant girl, barely 14, watched from the doorway. She had served the prince since childhood, bringing him books and tea and listening to his dreams of making the kingdom better. She watched the physicians work with tears streaming down her face. "Will he live?" she whispered to one of them. The physician glanced at her with his face grim. "Physically, probably. But the prince who existed yesterday." He shook his head. "The prince is dead. What remains is something else. Something broken beyond our ability to heal." The girl fled the room, unable to watch anymore. She ran through the corridors until she reached the servants' quarters, where she collapsed and wept. Word spread through the palace like plague. By nightfall, every servant, every guard, and every courtier knew what had been done. The official story that the prince had been punished for treason circulated alongside the whispered truth that a father had mutilated his son based on fabricated evidence and paranoid fear. The kingdom would never be the same. Neither would the king. That night, he sat alone in his chambers, staring at his hands, the hands that had signed the decree and that had ordered his own son's torture. He tried to tell himself it had been necessary, that he had saved the kingdom from civil war, that history would vindicate him. But all he could hear were his son's screams. All he could see was the look of betrayal in those eyes that would never see again. He had wanted to protect his throne. Instead, he had destroyed his soul. But blindness was only the beginning of his torment. Because what the king didn't understand, what he would only learn in the bitter years to come, was that by blinding his son, he had created something far more dangerous than a rival heir. He had created a symbol, a martyr, a living testimony to the king's cruelty and paranoia. The prince, broken and blinded, would haunt this kingdom far more effectively than he ever could have challenged it with his eyes intact. Chapter 7. The Prince in Exile. The fortress stood on the edge of the kingdom, 3 days' ride from the capital, perched on a cliff overlooking an endless expanse of grey sea. It was called Grimwatch, a name that needed no explanation. Built centuries ago to house political prisoners, too important to execute, but too dangerous to keep close, it was a place designed for forgetting. This would be the prince's home now. The journey there had been agonizing. Still recovering from his mutilation, the prince was transported in a covered wagon, bouncing over rough roads that sent fresh jolts of pain through his healing wounds. He sat in darkness, not the darkness of a covered wagon, but the permanent darkness that was now his world. He couldn't see the countryside passing by, couldn't see the villages whose people lined the roads, silent and grief-stricken, watching their beloved prince being taken away. Couldn't see the soldiers who escorted him with their faces troubled, wondering if they were protecting a traitor or participating in a crime. But he could hear, and what he heard told him everything. The silence of the crowds, not hostile but mourning. The uncomfortable shuffling of soldiers who didn't meet each other's eyes. The whispered prayers from peasants who thought he couldn't hear. God protect the prince. May the saints watch over him. We'll remember. The captain of the guard, a gruff veteran named Borin, sat across from the prince in the wagon. He had served the royal family for 30 years. He had bounced the prince on his knee when he was a toddler. "Your Highness," he said quietly, when they were an hour from Grimwatch, "if you need anything within my power, you need only ask." The prince's face, still bandaged, turned toward the sound of his voice. When he spoke, his voice was different than before, flatter and emptied of its former warmth. "I need my eyes back, Captain. Can you give me those?" Borin had no answer. Grimwatch's governor was an old man named Heston, a former general, who had been essentially retired to this remote posting. He received the prince with a mixture of pity and protocol. His orders were clear. The prince was to be held here indefinitely, treated with the respect due to his birth, but under constant watch. No visitors, no correspondence, no contact with the outside world. A comfortable prison, but a prison nonetheless. The prince's chambers were in the highest tower, spacious, well furnished, with windows overlooking the sea. Of course, windows meant nothing to him now. He would never see the sunrise painting the waters cold, and would never watch storms roll in from the horizon. That first night alone in his new prison, the prince finally allowed himself to pray. He had held himself together through the trial, through the blinding, and through the agonizing journey. But here in this remote tower, where no one could witness his weakness, he collapsed. He wept until he had no tears left. He raged at the walls, at God, and at the cosmic injustice of his fate. He called out for his father, his mother, and for anyone who might answer. No one came. Eventually exhausted, he fell silent. And in that silence, something began to change. The prince, who had been the optimistic, energetic young man who believed in justice and wisdom, the prince truly died in that moment. What remained had to learn to survive. The days blurred together. The prince had to relearn everything. How to move through spaces without seeing them, how to eat without making a mess, how to dress himself, and how to distinguish between day and night by temperature and sound alone. It was humiliating and exhausting. But he persisted. Governor Heston, despite his orders, couldn't help but admire the young man's resilience. He assigned a servant, an old woman named Mirah, who had lost her own son to war, to attend to the prince. She was patient and kind, guiding him without pity and treating him with the dignity his father had stripped away. "You are stronger than you know, Highness," she told him one morning as she helped him navigate his chamber. "What's been done to you is evil, but evil doesn't have the final word. Not if you don't let it." The prince stopped walking. What word could possibly come after this? "That's for you to decide," Mirah said simply. Weeks became months. The prince established routines. He learned the tower as every corner and could navigate it in perfect darkness, which was now his constant state. He asked Mirah to read to him histories, philosophies, and poetry. His mind at least remained sharp, and he began to hear things. Whispers from the guards who didn't realize how keen his hearing had become. Conversations drifting up from the courtyard below. News from the capital brought by supply ships and shared in hushed tones. The kingdom was not doing well. After the prince's blinding, something had broken in the kingdom's spirit. The people didn't rebel, not openly, but a coldness had settled over the land. Nobles withdrew to their estates. Merchants conducted their business with grim efficiency, but no enthusiasm. The songs in taverns grew darker, filled with veiled references to justice gone blind and fathers who devour their sons. The king had tried to continue ruling, but his authority had been fundamentally compromised. How could people trust a king who had tortured his own heir on fabricated charges? Alliances with other kingdoms weakened. Diplomatic envoys were received coolly. Enemies grew bolder, and through it all the question persisted. If the king could do this to his own son, what might he do to us? More disturbing were the reports of the king's deteriorating mental state. He had become paranoid beyond reason, seeing conspiracies everywhere. Corvus and his faction had filled the vacuum, effectively running the kingdom, while the king descended into madness. More nobles were arrested. More plots were uncovered. The palace had become a place of terror. The prince listened to these reports with a strange detachment. He should have felt vindication, proof that his father's cruelty had been unjust, but instead he felt only emptiness. The kingdom was suffering because of him, not because of anything he'd done, but because of what had been done to him. One night, 6 months into his imprisonment, the prince stood at his window. He couldn't see the sea, but he could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs far below. The sound was rhythmic, eternal, and indifferent to human suffering. "Do you know what they're saying about you?" Governor Heston's voice came from the doorway. The old general often visited, perhaps lonely in his own way, perhaps feeling guilty for his role in the prince's imprisonment. "What are they saying?" The prince asked. "That you're a saint, a martyr, that you bore injustice with grace, and that God will judge your father for what he's done." Heston moved to stand beside him. "There are shrines being built. Simple things, a candle and a prayer. People swear they see your face in their dreams, telling them to remain faithful and to wait for justice." The prince laughed bitterly. A saint. If they knew how much hate I carry, they wouldn't call me that, maybe Hestian said. Or maybe they'd call you human. Silence fell between them, filled only by the sound of waves. There's more, Hestian continued. Rebellions are starting. Small ones in the outer provinces. Nothing organized yet, but they're using your name. For the blind prince, they cry. For justice. Your suffering has become their rallying cry. The prince's hands gripped a windowsill. Tell them to stop. Send word I don't want rebellions in my name. You think they'd listen? You are no longer a person to them, Highness. You are a symbol. Symbols don't get to choose how they're used. The prince realized the terrible truth of this. By blinding him, and by making him a victim, his father had transformed him into something more dangerous than an ambitious heir. He had become an idea, and ideas are impossible to imprison. What do I do? The prince whispered, not really asking the governor, but the universe. You survive, Hestian answered. You endure. That's all any of us can do. But the prince was beginning to understand that survival itself was a form of resistance. Every day he lived, and every moment he maintained his dignity and sanity. He disproved his father's accusations. He couldn't see, but in his blindness, he had gained a different kind of sight, the ability to understand suffering, to empathize with the powerless, and to see in a way his father never could the true cost of cruelty. Word of this reached the capital. Reports came back of the prince's quiet dignity, his refusal to rage or seek vengeance, and his simple endurance. These reports troubled the king more than any conspiracy could have, because they revealed his son not as the threat he had feared, but as the victim he had created. And the kingdom saw it too. Poets began composing ballads about the blind prince. Artists painted scenes of his suffering. Priests preached sermons comparing him to Job, tested by injustice but remaining faithful. The more the king tried to erase his son, the larger his presence grew. In the tower at grim watch, the prince knelt in prayer one evening, not for vengeance, but for understanding. What do you want from me? He asked the darkness. What am I supposed to do with this? The darkness, as always, offered no answer. But deep in his heart, the prince was beginning to understand something. His father had tried to take away his ability to see, but perhaps vision was never about eyes. Perhaps true sight came from somewhere deeper, from the soul that refused to be broken, and from the spirit that remained unbowed. Even without eyes, the prince saw more clearly than the king ever would, and in that realization lay a quiet, powerful rebellion more threatening than any army. Chapter 8. The kingdom's descent in the capital, the palace, had become a labyrinth of fear. The king moved through its corridors like a ghost, haunted by decisions he could not undo. He had aged a decade in the year since his son's blinding. His hair had gone completely grey. His face was gaunt with eyes sunken and red from sleepless nights. He no longer trusted anyone. Corvus had consolidated his power with his network of informants reporting daily on potential threats. More nobles were arrested on charges of conspiracy, charges that were becoming increasingly absurd. A count was imprisoned for supposedly praising the prince in a private letter. A duchess was exiled for naming her newborn son after him. A merchant was executed for distributing bread with the prince's profile baked into the crust. The purges created a culture of paranoia. Courtiers stopped speaking freely, afraid that any word might be twisted into treason. Friends informed on friends. Families were torn apart by suspicion. The palace, once a center of culture and learning, became a place of whispered conversations and averted eyes. The king signed every arrest warrant and every execution order, but he no longer read them carefully. He simply trusted Corvus and his advisors, the same men who had orchestrated his son's downfall. He had gone too far to turn back now. To admit doubt would be to admit that the blinding had been wrong, and that admission would shatter what remained of his authority. So he pressed forward deeper into darkness. The economy collapsed. Without stable leadership, trade agreements fell apart. Foreign merchants stopped coming to the capital, unwilling to risk doing business in such an unstable kingdom. The treasury, already strained, began to run dry. Taxes were raised to punishing levels, further alienating the population. Rebellions erupted in 3 provinces simultaneously. They were quickly crushed by the military, but the fact that they had occurred at all was telling. The kingdom was fracturing, and everyone could see it except the men on the throne. Military commanders began to question their orders. General Aldrich, who had been present at the prince's trial and had seen the fabrication firsthand, grew increasingly disillusioned. He confided in trusted subordinates. "We're not serving the kingdom anymore. We're serving one man's paranoia." His words were reported to Corvus within hours. Aldrich was arrested on charges of treason, the same charges that had destroyed the prince. But Aldrich was a decorated war hero beloved by the troops. His arrest sparked outrage within the military ranks. A junior officer attempted to break him out of prison. The attempt failed and 20 soldiers were executed for their involvement. The king ordered Aldrich's trial to proceed quickly. But this time, something unexpected happened. The general refused to confess even under torture, and when brought before the court, he spoke openly. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said with his voice carrying through the throne room, "despite his broken body, I have served this crown for 30 years. I have bled for it, killed for it, and sacrificed everything for it. But I will not lie for it. The prince was innocent. You know he was innocent. And every day you continue this charade, you lose more of the kingdom you claim to protect." The court fell silent. No one had dared speak such truth in months. The king's face flushed with rage. "You dare." "I dare because I have nothing left to lose," Aldrich interrupted. "Execute me, torture me, but you cannot make me unsee what I saw. You destroyed your son based on lies, and now you are destroying your kingdom to cover up that truth." For a heartbeat, the king wavered. In Aldrich's eyes he saw something he hadn't seen in his own mirror for months. Honor. Integrity. The qualities he had once valued above all else. Then Corvus leaned close. "He's trying to manipulate you. This is exactly what traitors do, appeal to your emotions and make you doubt yourself." The king's face hardened. "Take him to the dungeons. Execute him at dawn." Aldrich smiled sadly. "Goodbye, Your Majesty. I'll pray for you. And for your son." He was dragged away. The execution took place as ordered, but its effect was the opposite of what the king intended. Instead of crushing dissent, it elevated Aldrich to martyrdom. Soldiers began wearing black armbands in his honor. Ballads were composed about the general who had spoken truth to power. The kingdom's nobility, seeing that even decorated heroes weren't safe, began to flee. Count families abandoned their estates overnight, taking their wealth and moving to neighboring kingdoms. The king's court, once one of the most prestigious in the realm, became a ghost town populated only by sycophants and terrified bureaucrats. Foreign powers saw opportunity in the chaos. Border provinces were invaded with barely a fight. The local militias, demoralized and underpaid, simply surrendered. Treaty partners broke their alliances, claiming that the kingdom no longer honored its commitments. The king called emergency councils, demanding solutions, but there were none to be found. How do you restore trust once it's been shattered? How do you rebuild authority when your own cruelty has undermined it? "We need a victory," one advisor suggested. "A military campaign to restore our prestige." But the military was fracturing, with officers unwilling to lead troops into battle for a king they no longer believed in. "We need a diplomatic success," another offered. New alliances. But who would ally with a kingdom descending into madness? The answer, unspoken but understood by everyone, was simple. They needed the prince. They needed to undo the blinding, to restore the heir, and to show that justice still existed in the kingdom. But that was impossible. The deed was done and irreversible. Late one night, the king found himself in his son's old chamber's rooms that had been sealed since the blinding. He opened the door with a key he'd kept hidden, stepping into a space that was exactly as his son had left it. Books on the shelves, maps on the walls, a writing desk still scattered with papers. The king picked up one of the papers. It was a treatise on justice the prince had been writing, discussing how rulers must balance mercy with strength. The handwriting was neat and thoughtful. "I was wrong," the king whispered to the empty room. "God forgive me, I was wrong." But God offered no absolution, and the room remained silent. The king sank into his son's chair and wept, not the controlled tears of the throne room, but the broken sobs of a man who had destroyed everything he loved and could never get it back. In the morning, he would return to the throne, put on the mask of authority, sign more warrants, and make more speeches. But in this moment alone in his son's chambers, he was just a father who had failed. History would not forgive what the king had done, and neither would he. Chapter 9 Echoes of a Fallen Dynasty. The collapse accelerated. Within 2 years of the blinding, the kingdom had lost a third of its territory. Provincial governors, seeing no help coming from the capital, declared independence or swore fealty to neighboring powers. The great kingdom that had stood for 5 centuries was dissolving like salt in water. Foreign courts watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Ambassadors sent detailed reports home, and those reports carried a consistent message. This is what happens when a ruler values his throne more than justice. The king and his kingdom became a cautionary tale discussed in universities and royal councils across the known world. The case of the blind prince entered political philosophy as the ultimate example of power corrupting and of paranoia destroying what it seeks to protect. Scholars wrote treatises comparing the king to ancient tyrants who had devoured their own children literally or figuratively. A famous philosopher in a neighboring kingdom wrote, "The tragedy is not that the king was cruel, but that he believed his cruelty was necessity." He convinced himself that blinding his son would save his throne, never understanding that the throne's only true foundation is the people's trust, and once shattered, that foundation cannot be rebuilt with fear. The text was banned in the capital, of course. But bans mean nothing when everyone is desperate for the truth. Artists painted scenes from the story. The prince kneeling in the chamber, the king turning away in anguish, and the empty throne room after Aldrich's execution. These paintings spread throughout other kingdoms, purchased by collectors who saw them as both historical documents and moral warnings. One particular painting became famous. It showed the king sitting on his throne, but the throne was made of bones and the crown on his head was dripping blood into his eyes. The symbolism was obvious. The king had built his power on the corpses of the innocent and was now blinded by his own crimes. Religious leaders used the story in sermons. The prince became a symbol of righteous suffering compared to saints who had endured unjust persecution. Churches began displaying images of him with eyes wrapped in bandages and hands raised in prayer. Whether historically accurate or not, the image resonated with anyone who had experienced injustice. "We are all the blind prince," one popular sermon proclaimed, stumbling in darkness, while those with power tell us we deserve our suffering. But like him, we must maintain our dignity, our faith, and our trust that truth will ultimately prevail. The king heard these sermons. His spies reported them faithfully. Each one was a knife in his gut and a reminder that his attempt to protect his legacy had instead destroyed it. Enemy kingdoms began incorporating the story into their propaganda. When they wanted to justify wars against the king as territory, they cited the blinding as evidence of tyranny that must be stopped. "We fight not to conquer," their generals proclaimed, "but to liberate the people from a monster who tortures his own children." It was effective. Cities surrendered without siege, with their people welcoming invaders as liberators. The king's name became synonymous with cruelty and injustice. Corvus tried to control the narrative, spending vast sums on poets and heralds to spread alternative versions of the story, versions where the prince really was a traitor and where the king was a tragic hero, forced to make an impossible choice. But the truth had momentum now. Lies, no matter how well funded, couldn't overcome it. The king's isolation became total. He rarely left his chambers. When he did appear in public, people averted their eyes, not out of respect, but out of shame and disgust. His own servants looked at him as if he were a ghost already dead, and simply waiting for his body to realize it. One day, a delegation from a neighboring kingdom arrived requesting an audience. They were led by a prince from that kingdom, a young man roughly the same age as the blind prince. The symbolism was not subtle. The visiting prince spoke with careful diplomacy, but his message was clear. "Your Majesty, the world is changing. Your kingdom is falling apart, but it's not too late for redemption. Restore your son. Bring him back from exile." Show the world that justice still matters to you. The king's hands trembled on the armrests of his throne. My son is where he belongs. With respect, your majesty, your son belongs on the throne, or at least free to live with dignity. What you've done is an abomination that stains not just your kingdom, but all of us. Every ruler is judged by your actions now. Every time a father looks at his son, he remembers your story. You've made us all suspect in our people's eyes. It was perhaps the most honest criticism the king had received, and it shattered what remained of his composure. Get out, he roared, all of you. Get out. The delegation withdrew, and later that day, their kingdom severed all remaining diplomatic ties. Another bridge burned, another ally lost. The kingdom's descent continued. Famine returned worse than before. Without functional government or trade networks, food could reach cities even when harvests were successful. People starved in the streets of the capital while the king hid in his palace, afraid to face what he had created. Plague followed famine, as it always does. Overcrowded slums filled with refugees from the lost provinces became breeding grounds for disease. The death toll climbed into the thousands, then tens of thousands. And through it all the story of the blind prince persisted. It became a legend, a myth, and a parable told to children. What happens when power matters more than love? Parents asked their children, and the answer was always the same. The kingdom falls, and everyone suffers. But the prince's story was far from forgotten. In universities, in taverns, in churches and markets, people spoke his name. They debated what he would have done differently and what kind of king he would have been. They mourned not just for him, but for the kingdom that might have existed if wisdom had prevailed over fear. And in a tower at Grimwatch, the prince himself heard echoes of all this. Smuggled letters, whispered reports from sympathetic guards, and songs carried on the wind from passing ships. He learned that he had become something he never intended to be. A symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that even in darkness dignity is possible. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the irony. He had tried so hard to serve his kingdom, and in being destroyed by it, he served it better than he ever could have from a throne. The fall of a dynasty is never sudden. It is 1,000 small collapses, and a cascade of failures building on each other until the entire structure gives way. And at the center of this collapse was one man's decision to blind his son rather than trust him. That decision would echo through centuries, studied by historians as one of the greatest political and moral failures in recorded history. Chapter 10, The Final Reflection. The documentary draws to a close with images of ruins. Not literal ruins, though those would come in time, but the ruins of trust, of family, and of a kingdom as soul. The camera lingers on empty throne rooms, on abandoned palaces, and on the faces of people who have lost faith in their leaders. The narrator's voice, somber and reflective, carries the weight of everything we've witnessed. The prince never regained his sight. He lived another 15 years in that tower by the sea, dying at age 38. Some say of illness, and others say of a broken heart. He never saw his father again. The king, consumed by guilt and paranoia, died 2 years before him, alone and unmourned. The kingdom they both loved fractured into smaller states, eventually absorbed by neighboring powers. The dynasty ended not with a battle or a revolution, but with a whimper, the natural death of an institution that had poisoned itself from within. But the story survived. It survived because it speaks to something universal, the fear that drives us to destroy what we love, the paranoia that transforms protectors into persecutors, the terrible irony that in trying to preserve power, we often guarantee its loss. We see it today, don't we? In boardrooms where CEOs eliminate talented subordinates who might outshine them. In governments where leaders suppress dissent rather than address it. In families where parents control their children so tightly that they strangle the relationship itself. The king's mistake was thinking that power comes from control, from eliminating threats, real or imagined. But real power comes from trust, from the willing loyalty of people who believe their leader serves them, not himself. By blinding his son, the king didn't save his throne. He revealed his fundamental unfitness for it. The screen shows one final image. A painting of the prince not as a victim, but as he was in his youth, hopeful, brilliant, and beloved. His eyes are bright and clear, looking directly at the viewer. Sometimes we study history to understand the past, but stories like this one exist to warn the future. How many kingdoms have fallen because rulers feared their own blood? How many families have been destroyed by parents who saw their children as competitors rather than continuations? How many bright futures have been extinguished by the paranoia of those who already had power? And how many more will repeat the same sin? The pattern recurs throughout history. A leader insecure in their position perceives a threat in someone close to them. Rather than address their own inadequacy or the systemic problems causing instability, they lash out at the perceived threat. The destruction is meant to secure their power. It never does, because power secured through betrayal, through cruelty, and through the violation of the most fundamental bonds, that power is no power at all. It's just fear wearing a crown. The tragedy of the blind prince is not just his story. It's ours. Every time we choose fear over trust, control over compassion, and paranoia over faith in others, we risk becoming the king in our own small kingdoms. And every time we do, we lose something infinitely more valuable than a throne. We lose our humanity. The documentary ends not with answers, but with a question hanging in the air. When you look at your life, your relationships, and your spheres of influence, are you the king or the prince? Are you destroying what you fear, or enduring what's been done to you with dignity? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme of the blind prince echoes still in every choice we make about power, about trust, and about whether we'll rule through fear or through love. The screen fades to black, but the story, like all great tragedies, remains. A warning, a reminder, a mirror held up to our darkest impulses. And the question lingers. What will we see when we dare to look?